Okay, good afternoon. We are done with the musculoskeletal system. So we are moving on to the central nervous system, the CNS. Please review the anatomy and physiology of the central nervous system. And then, so with the CNS, we will start with head injury. Head injury, right? Okay. So because it's one of the commonest conditions that is resulting to mental illness, and then other injuries like subarachnoid hemorrhage, subdural hemorrhages, etc. Right, and if not managed, it can cause serious complications. So we are going to start with head injury. Right, so if you talk about head injury, it refers to injury to the scalp or the brain, right? So if you take, so this is, let's say this is Michael's head, right? So if this is Michael's head, right, we have, this is the head, right? So the head is covered with hair. So we have the hair, right? The hair is attached to the skin, which we term as the scalp, right? So we have the scalp, right? And then under the scalp, there is a bone known as the skull bone. The skull bone, right? And then inside the skull bone is where we have the brain, right? So when we talk about head injury, it's an injury to either the scalp, right? So sometimes the injury can only affect the scalp without the skull bone. Sometimes it can penetrate the skull, the skin, and then cause fracture of the skull, right? And then at times it can break the skull and then cause injury to the brain itself, right? So when we talk about head injury, it refers to injury to the skull or the brain, right? It occurs when there is external force, or when external force is applied to the head and the brain, causing disruption of the physiologic stability, right? So when we have an external force, being it a blow, probably you are involved in a motor or car accident, and then your head hits, so you knock your head over something, right? That can also cause injury, or anything penetrating objects, being it a knife, being it a gun shot, etc. All these can cause head injury, right? So it occurs as a result of external force from any of these things that I've mentioned. The changes causes altered level of consciousness, right? So these changes can lead to decreased level of consciousness depending on the severity of the head injury. It can either be mild consciousness, or the person can have complete unconsciousness, right? Okay. Risk factors. Well, let's look at the risk factors for head injury. Risk factors for head injury. With head injury, the risk factors and the causes. So being a male under the age of 25 years of age is one of the risk factors. Some research work has, some authors have published that, or some research work have revealed that males under the age of 25, they are mostly involved in a lot of activities that can result in this head injury that we are talking about. So, and then people who are involved in motor vehicle accident or motorcycle crashes are also at risk of head injury. And then people above the age of 65, 75, because they are at risk of falls, right? So they can also sustain head injury. And then people who take in alcohol and other drugs, because it can alter the consciousness level, it can also result in head injury, right? And then apart from that, assault, right? Assault, probably being attacked by robbers or engaging in a fight, etc., can also result to head injury. Or somebody through a gunshot or anything can result to head injury. And then a fall, right? So you can, a fall from height, etc., can also result to head injury. So there are several, even as a birth complication can result to head injury, right? So when we have cephalopelvic disproportion, the mother's pelvic is smaller than the baby's head as compared to the baby's head. That can, or some obstructed labor or other birth complications where you use the vacuum delivery, etc. All these can result to head injury. So let's look at the pathophysiology of head injury. What happens? Pathophysiology. Okay, so pathophysiology of head injury. What happens when there is head injury? Right, with the pathophysiology, most of the time we start from the cause, right? So it can result from either a blow, right? So being it mechanical. So mechanical can be in the form of using an object to hit the head, right? Being it a gun, a knife, anything, a wood, etc., right? Or any penetrating object through the skull, right? So it can be a gun, it can be a knife. That's someone penetrates it, or someone stab you through the skull, right? Or a blow, right? When you are engaged in a fight, right? So all these are things that can result to head injury, right? And then depending on the severity of the injury, right? So if it's just a knock and then the blood vessels are not affected, sometimes it's only the brain that moves, right? So the brain moves within the skull, right? And that can cause what you call either concussion or contusion. So sometimes the blood vessels is not affected, then there will be no bleeding, but it can still affect your level of consciousness. But where the head injury is severe, sometimes the blood vessels is affected. So if the blood vessels are affected, then it means that the person will have internal bleeding, where you are going to have either subarachnoid or subdural hemorrhage, right? And then when you have head injury, because it's a form of injury, the body tries to respond to resolve that injury through the inflammatory process, right? And then you know that with the inflammatory process, there will be vasodilation, there will be increased blood flow to the site of injury, and this time we are talking about the head, right? And then there will be seepage of fluid from the vessels to the surrounding tissues around, right? So there will be edema around the brain tissues where the injury is, and that can cause severe pain. And the edema, depending on the level of edema and then the level of bleeding, sometimes they cause further they compress on the vessels around the brain, right? And then if it's not resolved early, it means that you're going to obstruct blood flow to the brain, and it's going to cause further damage, right? So that is what happens in brain injury, right? So if the vessels are affected, then it means that the person is going to have internal bleeding in the brain, so leading to subarachnoid or subdural hemorrhage. So these people mostly should undergo craniotomy, right, where there is a surgical incision through the cranial bones to resolve the injury. Otherwise, gradually it can even lead to stroke and other complications if not treated. So let's look at types of head injury. Types of head injury. We have scalp injury, So injury to the scalp, as I said, the hair on the head is attached to the scalp, right? That is the skin, right? So you can just have an injury to the scalp alone. Let's assume that someone is shaving you, right? And then the blade cuts the scalp. That one, the scalp bone is not affected. It's only the scalp that is affected, right? But depending on the extent of injury, sometimes it can penetrate the scalp and then it can affect the scalp bones, right? And then especially if it's a penetrating object, sometimes it can even pierce the scalp bone and then the brain will be affected. So there are a few cases where sometimes there's an accident and then the scalp bone, the skin, that's the scalp, is open, and then sometimes the scalp bone is even open and then the brain is out, right? So it depends on the severity of the head injury, right? So these are the various types of head injury that we have. We can have injury to the scalp, injury to the skull, and then injury to the brain. Injury to the brain. So let's look at skull fractures. Skull fractures. Okay, so fracture to the skull. We've already done fractures, so it should not be anything that is difficult for us to understand, right? But the skull fractures, we can have a form of fracture known as a linear fracture, a depressed fracture, a compound fracture, or comminuted fracture, or even you can have a closed fracture. So I'll go over again. You can have a linear skull fracture. You can have a depressed skull fracture. You can have a compound skull fracture or a closed skull fracture, and then comminuted skull fracture, right? So just like the normal fracture that we've talked about, the skull fracture can either be open or closed. There can be injury to the head where the skull, there's fracture of the skull without the skin being involved, right? So the skin will be intact, right? Or that is what you term as a closed skull fracture, right? But the compound skull fracture is where there is an injury to the head, and then the skull fracture affects the skin, the underlying skin. So it opens into the underlying skin. So we term that one as a compound skull fracture. A linear skull fracture is where there is a break in the bone continuity, right? So it's a form of horizontal break, right? So it's a horizontal break. So with that type of fracture, we term it as, and it's a simple fracture, we term it as a linear skull fracture. And then a depressed skull fracture is when the fracture bone depressed inwards. So there is an external force on the head, and then it causes fracture of the skull, and then it breaks and then moves inwards and compress on the brain, right? That is what we term as a depressed skull fracture. We can also have comminuted skull fracture where the skull bones break into pieces, right? And that is what we term as comminuted skull fracture. Okay, so we can read on the others. Apart from that, it can also be classified based on the location. Skull fracture can be classified based on the location, right? So if the skull fracture occurs in the frontal part of the head, we can term it as frontal skull fracture. If it occurs at the sides, the temporal parts, we can term it as temporal skull fractures, right? So depending on the location, exactly where the skull fracture is occurring, right? Because we know of that the back is the occiput, the front is the frontal part, the parietal part, and then the temporal part. So depending on where the fracture is occurring, then we can name it based on the location. We can also have another type of skull fracture known as the basilar skull fracture when it occurs at the base of the skull, right? We term it as basilar skull fracture. Okay, let's look at fracture, injury to the brain, right? So sometimes it's not only the fracture, but the brain is also involved. So let's look at injury to the brain.